We'll talk about pollination. The objectives of this video will be to define pollination, to list the different ways and types of pollination, and to describe the difference between wind and insect pollinated flowers. So, this is a summary of this chapter. You can take a screenshot, read it after we finish this video. Now, the transfer of pollen from the anthers to the stigma is called pollination. So, if you were asked to define pollination, you should mention that it is a transfer of the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. Now, there are two ways or three ways which the pollen grains can be transferred from a plant to the same plant or to a different plant. They could be transferred by insects, animals, or by wind, and we will talk in details about the ways they could be transferred later on in this video. Now, the two types of pollination are self-pollination, and it's from its name, it's either in the same plant, it will simply be transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of the same plant, or cross-pollination, which is the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another plant. So the key word in cross is different, while in self it is the same flower or the same or two different flowers but the same plant. So it's either from one flower to another in the same plant, that's self-pollination, or cross-pollination, which is from one plant to a different plant, and of course it should be from the same species. That's another slide that shows the difference between cross and self-pollination. So the transfer of pollen grains from one flower or from one plant to another plant from the same species, that's cross-pollination, or from the anther of one plant to the stigma of the same plant, that's self-pollination. Now, if you were asked to list or to explain the advantages of cross-pollination and self-pollination, there are certain things you should mention. Cross-pollination, because it happens between different plants, it improves the genetic variation, while self-pollination, and this is considered a disadvantage, it reduces genetic variety of the offspring because all the gametes come from the same parent and therefore they are not genetically different, they are all identical. And it is important to mention that this was mentioned in one of the external exam questions. It was said to explain or list the disadvantages of and advantages of both cross and self-pollination. Now, how can pollen grains be transported? Either they can be transported by wind, simply blown by wind, or by animals or insects. Now, as we know, the insects, they are the major pollinators. The pollen grains could stick to their body, and then when they can travel from one flower to another, they can simply transfer the pollen grains or by wind. Now, insect pollinated flowers have certain structures. Now, most of them, they have brightly colored petals to attract the insects, and they have scents, and they can produce nectar, And the dark lines, the honey guides on the petals, are believed to help direct the insects to the nectar source and thus bring them into contact with the stamens and the stigma. Now, if you were asked to list the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers, they have large colored petals, they have scents, bright colors to attract insects. So it is important to mention that the anthers and the stigma, they are inside the flower, they are covered inside the flower, so that the insect has to brush past them to reach the nectar, and thereby the pollen grains could stick into the insect or the bee, and then it could be transferred. So the pollen grains, here we're talking about the pollen grains or the pollens, not the flowers or the plants. So if you were asked to list the characteristics of pollen grains that are in the insect pollinated flowers, they are spiky, they are sticky, and they are large. They are in large quantities most of the time, so that they could spread, and there would be an advantage in spreading the pollens. So here's a summary of the insect pollinated flowers. It is very important to know the labeling of the structure and the structure of the flower, and to know the features of these plants: petals, the scent and nectar, the number of pollen grains, the pollen grains themselves, the anthers, and the stigma. Now, the wind pollinated flowers. The wind pollinated flowers are not pollinated by insects, they are pollinated by wind. And to be pollinated by wind, of course, they should be lightweight, and they should have a certain structure that help them transfer easily by the wind. They are not scented because there is no need to attract insects, and they are usually dull, they don't have bright colors, and they are lightweight, as we said. So here the stamens, they hang outside to release the pollen easily, while in the insect pollinated flowers we said they should be inside the flower so that the bee or the insect brush and it sticks to their body. Their anthers are large, and the flowers usually hang down so that it could be easily transported or transferred. An important feature also is that in the stigma they have a feathery structure that helps stick the pollens into it. So that's a summary of wind pollinated flowers. We said the anthers are exposed, the stigmas are feathery, there is no scent, the petals are usually small and green, and the pollen grains are very small and light. That's another picture. Stigma is feathery, the filament is long and loose, and the anther is loaded with huge amounts of pollen. So how are plants adapted for wind pollination? This question could be explained or described. Usually it's explained. So those points should be mentioned as an answer to this question. Now, as we said, the male part of the flowers, which are the anther and the filament, are designed to expose pollen to the wind so that the pollen can easily be blown by air currents. How? The filaments are often long, with anthers dangling on the end, thus exposing the pollen to the air currents. While the female parts, they are long, they are feathery, so they are ideally designed to capture the pollen as it's blown on the currents. The pollens of wind-pollinated flowers, the wind-pollinated plants produce huge quantities of pollen to increase the chances of pollination. They are very light in texture, they are smooth, and they usually have small air sacs to help them stay in the air and help them to be transferred easily. So here are some characteristics of wind-pollinated um, flowers, the pollens. They have air sacs, they have wing-like structure, and as we said, the pollens are produced in huge amounts. So that's a summary of wind-pollinated flowers: the petals, the scent and nectar, the number of pollen grains, the anthers, and the stigma. So test yourself. The diagrams show pollen grains from 3 different species. The diagrams are all to the same scale. Which pollen grains are involved in insect pollination? Another question: what type of pollination does this flower have? Give 3 ways shown by the flower that make it adapted for this type of pollination.